General Naram Sin surveyed the battlefield with apprehension and a creeping feeling of helplessness. He'd been tasked with halting the advance of the Vroskil on the capital of the Keshi homeworld by the order of the Galactic Coalition's Grand Council. He'd been given command of a coalition grand army of 500,000 soldiers that contained a contingent from every member of the coalition, as had been their tradition for centuries. An army of this size had not been gathered in over 200 galactic years, and he expected to overawe the Vroskil into surrendering or flight. But they hadn't been that accommodating. The Vroskil had appeared on the border of coalition space about 2 galactic years ago, with claims of friendship and trade. They said one of their probes came across a derelict Tato exploration ship that had suffered a catastrophic decompression after something pierced their hull in several places, possibly an asteroid storm. None of the crew survived, but the computer core was intact and let them determine the ship's origin. They said they wanted to return the bodies of the crew, but the ship was too damaged and broke up while being towed to a station. And so this gesture led to the Tato and the Galactic Coalition welcoming them with open arms. Or most of them anyway. The humans were reserved in their dealings with the Vroskil, but the Council assumed it was because the humans only recently joined the coalition. They just didn't know any better, many of the Grand Councilors said. They brushed aside their concerns without even listening to them. Others thought they were jealous of the trade deals the newcomers were making, especially the markets the humans had yet to gain access to. Eventually, the humans gave up on their attempts to advise caution in dealings with the Vroskil. It was 6 months ago they found out that humans were right not to trust them. A Vroskil armada crossed the border into Tato space to devastate their homeworld and several colony worlds. There were few survivors, and those that did reported outages in subspace communication and power grids. After determining the same thing happened at the same time on the other colony worlds, it became obvious they were sabotaged by the Vroskil. All their claims of wanting peaceful trade were just an excuse to scout coalition defenses and future targets. 4 systems fell before the sluggish coalition military tried to fight back. But having been at peace for over a century meant their navies were better suited to fight pirates than full-size warships. Once again, the humans tried to warn them, but they weren't as technologically advanced as the rest of the coalition forces, so what did they know? Even after a Vroskil fleet attacked a human colony world but was driven off by a smaller human fleet, they called it luck and a diversion on the Vroskil's part. The coalition lost every engagement against the Vroskil in space and on the ground. Over the last several decades of peace, their military had become what the humans dismissively called a parade ground army. Human officers would say they looked good during ceremonies, but their training was woefully inadequate, out of date, and far too reliant on advanced technology. Once again, the coalition military high command ignored their advice. Humans still used projectile weapons. What do such primitive people know? And despite their offers of assistance, the humans were not asked to join in combat operations with the rest of the coalition military. They were told to stay and guard their worlds. The high command just said they only needed more men, ignoring the reports of the few survivors of battles that their tactics were inadequate to deal with the constantly shifting tactics of the Vroskil. No matter how perfectly they followed the plans devised by the high command, the Vroskil just found a weak spot and exploited it. The invasion of the Keshi homeworld finally convinced the high command to invite the humans to fight with them. Rumors spread that it was only because they needed the numbers. They were told to only send a contingent, not their whole military, to assist. The humans shrugged their shoulders and sent a single division of 50,000 soldiers and support units, letting them be practically self-sufficient with their own heavy weapons, transports, medical units, and others. And so the largest fleet the Grand Coalition has assembled in centuries set out for Keshi, and dropped out of FTL to find a Vroskil fleet already in orbit. Troop transports began to make planetfall while the warships engaged the Vroskil. The human warships were on the far right end of the battle line and drove into the Vroskil flank before they were fully deployed. The Vroskil knew what was going to happen if they stayed after the humans broke their far left and started to lap around behind the others, so they disengaged and fled the field. The fleet admiral thought they'd fled his superior numbers. The humans didn't waste time trying to correct him. General Naram Sin watched his army disembark with satisfaction. Decked out in their gleaming body armor, marching off the ships in step, lined up in neat rows, and presented their pulse rifles. Just like they were on the parade ground before the high command. Well, except the humans, their body armor was a dull green, and several of them trotted off in different directions. Others helped unload their equipment of archaic weapons. Their weapons fired small projectiles via chemical propulsion. There were vehicles with long tubes sticking out the top. They called it a self-propelled gun. And they had a variety of other weapons, even some type of knife. How primitive they were. General Naram Sin had no idea what to do with them, so he left them to guard the landing ships. The human officer seemed annoyed, but saluted and told his troops to dig in. The humans began digging all kinds of holes around the ships, but the general didn't understand why. Were they going to hide from the enemy? How cowardly of them. Once all of his troops had disembarked, he formed them into a column and went out to find the enemy, minus the humans, of course. They looked impressive in their shining body armor and perfectly ordered columns. The Roskilde would take one look at his vast numbers and run away. He was sure of it and took no effort to send out scouts on his flanks. He didn't need them, since his hand scanners would suffice. His sensors finally found the enemy army, and it wasn't even 1/4 of the army he led. He deployed his troops into a battle line and marched to meet the enemy. His army finally caught sight of the hated Vroskil. The Vroskil fired a few shots before they turned and ran away. General Naram Sin laughed when he saw them run away. He knew it, but they wouldn't get away. He ordered his army to chase them, and being the fastest race in the army, ordered the Norcane contingent to catch them and pin them down until the rest of the army caught up. With the Norcane sprinting ahead, he ordered his troops into 4 columns and followed at the double quick. He smiled at the idea of his quick victory, and in the blink of an eye, everything changed. They just passed where they first saw the Vroskil lined up when the fleeing enemy turned around and opened fire on the Norcane chasing them. It was like they ran into a buzzsaw and hundreds went down. Caught by surprise, his army stopped their pursuit, and then the other shoe dropped. Vroskil soldiers popped up out of their hiding spots and sent a fusillade of shots into both flanks of his army. Their energy weapons pierced his troops' armor with ease, and they'd barely begun to return fire when the ground erupted around them, when the Vroskil set off the hidden explosive charges they placed underground. This was the last straw for the untested army, and it shattered into its component pieces. It was every contingent for themselves. General Naram Sin managed to keep his people's contingent of Shirian troops along with 3 other races together, leaving him with 1/4 of the troops he started with. All the others panicked and ran. The Vroskil gleefully shot them down in great numbers. The general hoped that his group could retreat and escape in good order during the chaos, but there were far more Vroskil than he imagined, with shots from behind telling him they were almost surrounded. He tried to call for help, but all he got was static. The Vroskil was probably jamming his comm channels. Not knowing what else to do, he ordered his troops to take cover in the blast holes created by the explosions. The only saving grace for his reduced command is there were so many fleeing coalition soldiers that not all of the Vroskil fire was directed at them. But his troops were slowly being whittled down by the accurate Vroskil fire. Their heavier weapons made this terrifying thunderclap when fired. Its psychological impact was almost more dangerous than the energy bolts it fired. He could see the increasing panic on the faces of the troops he had left. General Naram Sin said a silent prayer to his ancestors to prepare himself for the end. He didn't even notice the new sounds on the battlefield, a series of pops, cracks, and other noises he couldn't describe. A moment later, he heard a whistling noise followed by a huge boom coming from the massive fountains of dirt tossed up in the air by artillery fire. He peeked over the edge of the hole he was in to see hundreds of humans firing into the startled Vroskil. He was amazed as he watched them moving forward, with one group of humans running forward and flopping to the ground. While they were firing on the Vroskil, another group of humans ran past them and took cover. They began firing at the enemy, and the first group ran past them, took cover, and fired at the enemy. They kept this up until they nearly reached the Vroskil position. Their dull armor also made them harder to see, and only a few were hit by the pitiful Vroskil return fire. General Naram Sin enjoyed the screams and wailing coming from the Vroskil as the humans attacked them from several directions. The Vroskil were used to having their own way in their fights with the Coalition. They were caught completely by surprise and had no idea how to respond. They made a critical error in a combat situation and were left with only two options: flee or die in place. Those who hesitated were lost as more and more humans reached the battlefield. It took less than a quarter hour to finish off the last of the Vroskil. Human medics began to scour the field for those wounded they could still save. A human approached him, saluted in their fashion, and identified himself as Colonel Sellers, Terran Marines. General Naram Sin returned the salute with a huge sense of relief and thanked the colonel with effusive praise. "So one of my messages got through?" he asked. "Messages? We didn't get any messages," the colonel replied. "How did you know to come here and save us?" A confused General Naram Sin asked. "Our commander saw some of the fleeing troops heading for the dropships and thought something went wrong," the colonel replied. "So he dispatched my command to link up with you." "Which officer told you how to find us? It might balance out his fleeing," the general angrily asked. "Sir?" the colonel asked, looking confused. "Oh, no one, sir." "No one? Then how did you know where to find us? The Vroskil had jammed all my comm channels and I couldn't broadcast our location." An increasingly confused general asked. The colonel smiled and replied, "An old Terran military maxim, sir. In the absence of any other orders, always march to the sound of the guns." The general mulled it over for a second before replying, "It seems you humans know more about war than I assumed." Addressing the colonel, "Well, Colonel, I think I need to look into this more, so take me to your leader." At this, several nearby humans broke into laughter. The colonel silenced them but couldn't completely hide his amusement as he said, "Yes, sir."